So these are some of the images that you've been putting together to conceive of what the Kuromizu Enterprises factory looks like. And this is a very ominous looking piece. Where did these ideas come from?
Well, I was thinking about what might happen during the nitty-gritty process of breaking down the chicken into the product and how that might come about. And I thought I would start looking at some structures that would explain how this occurred, and in a physical space how that would happen. This particular image, I devised a series of conveyor belt like machines, I suppose, and the idea for me would be that the scale of the conveyor belt would reflect the length of the time span of the chicken. So it was a very slow moving machine, and in each of these they look like little baskets that perhaps the chickens live inside those, and they start off as an egg at the bottom, and then they grow, and by the time they get to the top they're 6 weeks old or however old, and then they get to the top, and then they disappear over the precipice inside and go down into the workings of the actual machine, which is like kind of in the guts, and they get processed.
So this is literally, these baskets are on a conveyor.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. So you can see visually the passage of time and where they're going. So we were discussing earlier about different starting points for what the plant and factory could look like. And we discussed, the possibilities of some areas being very mechanized and machine-based, and other ones looking more organic and Gothic and kind of anatomical. So this is a very machine-based image, and then you have a much more organic, almost bone-like one. And what were your thoughts that inspired this image?
Well, I was thinking about structures that have a kind of history within them. So maybe how caves can sometimes, you can see their history geology-wise, sort of with bones inside, or kind of the layering of different sediments as time's passed. And I was thinking, if this structure has had a history of animals growing within inside it, perhaps you can see the remnants of those animals and the fact that they lived and died there. So I was thinking about skeletons within the shapes and how big they were, and whether you could kind of pass through these structures and not really know that you're actually walking through a chicken skull, but it's definitely part of the whole system. And I was like, is it part of the history, or is it part of the mechanics of it? And this was just sort of playing with those different sort of notions. But the sort of bridge-like structure is meant to be a walkway so that they pass along it, but perhaps it's kind of perilous because it's full of holes, and if there were a lot of chickens living on there, you could imagine perhaps some of them falling down the holes and ending up in, that's the end of them sort of thing.
But also, I think as you mentioned earlier, you were looking at a structure that's kind of like a living, breathing structure, but in the same way that bone or skeleton, like these things are secreted over time to help build the actual structure itself. So it's not living in the usual colloquial sense of the word, but it's made from materials in the same way that a coral reef might be built. It is kind of living, and there are other bacterial agents and things that help to build the structure that live off of the refuse of the chickens and things that inhabit it.
I can imagine there's sort of like different scales of organism within this whole structure. So like you say, bacteria, and then grubs and worms, and then the chickens are the next scale up, and it's sort of, there's different sort of levels within the actual matter itself, and then some of the things you can read, so that it looks like bones, but then if you have to pull back really far to see the fact that it's actually like a whole chicken's head in that image. And if you were to, the next sketch, which is...
I have to say before you move on, actually, that one of the ideas I think that came out of our conversation, I think is very cool, is this idea that the structure itself is being built and grown by feeding off the very chickens that are in there, because it's sort of a self-contained autonomous structure. So, considering that it doesn't have any humans living there, it's a completely, remote operated facility, then it makes sense that the facility can repair itself, or it can grow in size to accommodate its production capacity by living off of some of the chicken matter that's produced there. So it's this kind of wonderful ecology, wonderfully weird ecology, that's self-sustaining and recycling.
Yes, there's one thing that I really love is sort of the process of wattle and daub, where you have a sort of a structure, and that could be a bone structure or some kind of organic like sticks or twigs, and then you find a matter that you can kind of embed into that, and it can be mulched up tissue or the waste product of the actual chickens that's not used for any particular purpose apart from just to build the architectural structure of the place itself. And that can come in any format, and so it can kind of it's really pliable. You can sculpt it into any kind of shape or form, so it can be as the shape itself, it kind of lends itself to how the chickens best want to live, which I was imagining is ledges where they just kind of thousands and thousands of them are kind of all packed together, and they kind of exist in these tight spaces, and the machine kind of keeps producing more and more layers for them to keep growing and have more and more chickens above and
and I think we should point out that one of the things that came out of this brainstorm was the idea that there are lots of different chickens that are raised for different purposes. So we have the processed chicken that ends up in like chicken McNuggets that really doesn't have to look pretty, just has to create the bulk and the protein content and fat content required. And the chickens themselves might look quite hideous and deformed and mutated. And then you have the chickens that are sold whole and have to look pretty to the end customer. So those ones are pampered in a different way. And we were kind of fantasizing actually about how the free-range chickens might live in an environment where they're allowed to roam around freely for a period of time, but actually it's a very aggressive and frightening environment, because the reason they roam around is that they're only given food at a certain times of day, and the food is a free-for-all food fight. In other words, they've got to compete for resources, and only the fittest survive, and so it's a horrible, horrible place. And then finally there are chickens that are egg layers, and that's all they do. They just are pumped full of the nutrients required to pump out eggs as frequently and as large as possible. So there's a kind of hierarchy amongst the chickens themselves, and they all look different and they behave differently, and the habitats they inhabit would be very different as well.
Talking about having a sort of sorting system of something, where perhaps the eggs get analysed or the chicks get analysed, and then they get rehoused into the correct area of the whole plant, as it were. And this next concept, I was thinking about a machine or an animal or some kind of organism that is genetically modified itself in order to know how to select the right chickens. And it can kind of go in there, and these little tendrils perhaps either service the chickens, or they can take the right ones or take the old ones or the dead ones away, so that you can see them kind of going down little tubes or little passages, or they're just being moved around. But then perhaps right down in the bottom of this structure is where the actual processing of the actual parts of the chicken happen.
So what we're looking at here, this image looks like terraces, of organic matter. And the scale, you imagine, is quite big, because each of these sort of tendrils that lead down this spinal column, as it were, are big enough for a chicken to be sucked down.
Yes.
And it's you said you were influenced by ants and bees and the habitats that they create by secreting materials to build them, right? So this has been influenced by that thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just like the idea that it's almost never ending, and
in fact, the chickens above and below may be recipients of the nutrients and other chicken material it passes through. So
it makes for a pretty hellish space.
Exactly, a very kind of cannibalistic environment.
This is just a kind of it was a very rough model that I made, just with a side cutaway, just to look at more detail about where the kind of the carousel element of the processing part of the structure is. And if you can imagine the chickens being fed into the top of that once they've been living in the ledges above, the machine is turning, and it's also another slow process where they have the different things happen to them, like they have their feathers removed at the very top level, and then they slide down and they get onto the next wheel, and then they're pinned down. And I was imagining also the types of sort of almost robotics that would be dealing with the chickens, but I wanted them to be maybe more organic as well. So I was thinking about maybe like the sort of crustacean type claws that would be pulling the chickens apart, and whether you have the machinery is like bone itself, very razor sharp bones can be used to cut the chicken. So I thought, is it a combination of metal and organic material on this level? And I think it probably is.
Well, razor bone is very, very cool because it can be repaired. if a razor knife, if a bone knife breaks, it just regrows the blade. So it's very self-sufficient, self-sustaining. And you were telling me a little bit about, during your research, you came across some of the stages that chickens have to pass through in their processing. Can you recall some of that again? Because I thought it was hideously fascinating.
Well, I think the first thing that they do is the chicken has to have its throat cut, and then it has to have its oil gland removed from its neck. So you would need, a sort of a point where they are held almost in a line, in a tube, and then they have that part sort of happens very quickly, and then they are next dipped into a vat of boiling hot water, which loosens the feathers, and then they would perhaps go into a kind of drum with. This is actually how they do it. I think they have the drum has fingers or rubber fingers inside, and this loosens the feathers. It kind of massages the skin, and all the feathers drop out. And once that's happened to them, they're very disorientated, and they've been tumbling around at this point. They're dead, but must look really bizarre. They would then slide down into another kind of tray or a pod, and then that's when they're going to be sliced, or they're going to have incisions made to remove the meat from the actual structure.
And you were saying something about some of the more advanced robotic machinery, how it does the cutting. How does that go again?
They will actually scan the chicken in its entirety, and then the robot will adjust itself, millimeter adjustments, so to make the kind of most shallow cuts possible, because that's the most efficient method of removing the meat from the bone. And so each particular chicken is catered to by the machine. It adjusts for everyone, and it's very fast the way that it happens. It's kind of amazing.
I'm imagining like an auto assembly plant where all these surgical blades or lasers come into position, slice up the bird, and that's the end of it. It all happens in the blink of an eye. It's wonderfully creepy. Also, I should point out that this kind of carousel-like structure, you are influenced by sort of nautilus and shell-like structures, or the sea urchins and whatnot. And we'll have to look at some of your sketch work, because it's really fascinating. But it appeals to me because whenever I've seen chicken culling equipment that's maybe a little less technologically advanced, it tends to be a carousel. I saw this one where chickens were put onto a wheel. They're hung by their necks, and the wheel goes around, and a rotating blade takes their heads off, and the machine sort of holds them in place so they can jingle jangle around and then drop off. And so something about a carousel, I think, is compelling, because it's a weird juxtaposition of like, oh, a carousel, it's a happy fun ride, but also it's horrible. I love that kind of strange juxtaposition of adrenaline and fear. This is taken from some of the sketchbook research that you have, and these are real chicken batteries. Where were these batteries? Do you know?
I don't know whereabouts in the world those have been taken, but I think that's fairly standard. It seems to me that they just have the same format, and it's just really, really tight spaces, and a lot of the time the chickens are standing on wire, and that's kind of defines the look really for the actual cages. They're
very low tech and kind of decrepit looking, which I think we would be a little different, because I think that our facility would, well, if it's organic looking in parts, that gives it kind of a tarnish, and it's very interesting. But I think there'd be other parts of the plant that would look like a medical center, like a biotechnology facility that's really clean and bright, and like you're assembling silicon chips or something. And so it'd be interesting to look at how the different areas can be conceived differently. But I don't think that some of this stuff just looks really dirty and sad and depressing, and I think we'd look at things in a slightly different way. Even though what goes on there is pretty horrific and sad and depressing in its own right, I think it just visually would be more interesting to treat it. I think some of these, this sketch you did here, is quite fascinating.
Well, if it is an animal that's in control of itself, it would essentially keep itself clean, which, even if the process is producing blood and guts, you'd imagine it's got some way of sort of tidying up after itself. And that could be part of it. It's got little sweepers, like you say, or it has more tendrils which can hoover up the waste products as they get splattered around, or it's sort of licking itself, with nasty, that sort of little tongues going around cleaning the walls.
Well, this is kind of interesting, because it almost looks like a beautiful reception center, except that it has this kind of odd hose thing over here.
Well, and that was I was thinking about, maybe there was an existing building and they took it over, or it kind of got colonized. it's just that sort of old industrial kind of structure, like but it's very obvious when you go into those kind of spaces. The machines speak for themselves. You can see exactly what it is that they're kind of doing. They don't hide anything. The workings are all there. You can see the guts of the building and what happens. It's all very exposed.
What I love about it is that, this machinery looks so ominous and frightening without intentionally being so. It's sort of forlorn, forgotten, pneumatic, rusty, sharp. Oh, it's just seeing it gives me goosebumps. It's very, very unusual. So here are some sort of shell sketches that you took initially to inspire some of the work. And what was it about the shell design that you felt was really appropriate?
I thought it was interesting because, to me, shells are interesting on two levels. When they're alive, they don't look like living organisms because they're cold and hard and rigid, but they're actually growing all the time, and they get bigger and bigger. I mean, if you look at sea urchins on rocks, they're always growing, and I like the idea of having a sort of never-ending series of chambers that just, you think you've got to the end, but the thing has grown by the time you get there, so there's more to it. And I like the idea that after the animal who was living there originally died, or it died, that perhaps somebody else comes along after that and inhabits that space, like a crab will go and find a home within another shell that it just likes the look of.
So it can be repurposed.
Yeah.
Here's a great, you said this was bees that created this kind of hive lattice structure?
Yeah, and the bees are creating the structure by eating wood and then mulching it up and then regurgitating it, I believe, and forming these little systems. And I love the fact that it looks like it's got levels of its own, and it's a lovely organic kind of shape.
It's very beautiful sculpturally, and this tethered balloon.
Yeah.
What is this one?
This is a sort of idea of how perhaps the structure, the battery exists somewhere off from Earth, so that it's not part of the rules and regulations that we have here, and the animal just kind of, or the organism just kind of does its own thing, floats around in space, and it just looks after itself, but it's connected so that the product comes back down, down to earth, and we get from it what we want, but it's essentially just floating around doing its own thing.
I should say that there is an interesting reveal in the story that's not unrelated to this idea, and it came up completely independently. We haven't discussed this, so I think that's fascinating. We're on the same wavelength there. This pink snake, what's the story behind this?
Well, I believe that's actually a sort of combination of chicken matter. I think it's the meat and possibly various parts of the chicken that you maybe wouldn't otherwise eat. When it's all mashed up, it ends up looking pink and fleshy, and I think that's what perhaps makes chicken nuggets. But it's part of a series of photographs I've discovered looking at chicken manufacturing process, unidentified.
I mean, I love the fact that it looks like the fellow is just picking this thing up as if it was a big long sausage, and it's somehow holding itself together. It is really bizarre.
Yeah, it just looks wrong, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I was quite surprised. I thought, goodness me, there's lots of things happening in these spaces that you just wouldn't expect to see, very alien kind of things going on.
I imagine, too, that if you worked there, you'd treat all this very matter-of-factly, but you would never want to eat a chicken McNugget again after all that.
No, absolutely not.
And these are cave designs that you've come across that you were thinking it would be interesting if the chickens kind of inhabit a cave-like structure.
As an alternative to the standard sort of wire and mesh that's used to construct our human versions of these kind of battery farms, how chickens could be housed, or how they would live in similarly sort of nasty confines, but if it was an organic structure. And I thought that bone marrow or rock can have a lot of porous surfaces, so that there's little niches where the chickens maybe live. And at some points, the smaller birds, the sizes of these holes can vary massively. Within a bone, there are bigger holes within the middle of the bone, and as you get out towards the outside of the bone in cross-section, the bone becomes more solid towards the outside, so the hole size kind of changes. So you could have bigger birds in the bigger holes, and then the smaller chicks in the smaller holes towards the outside, or they get moved around depending on what stage of their life they're at.
When we were first talking about this, an idea came up that you have all these little chicks living in these holes in the rock or bone, and this sort of automated, surgical arm moves around dropping food into their mouths like it's the big chicken mommy chicken. And then as it's feeding them, it's sort of performing an analysis. And if it sees that there's a genetic defect or something of some kind, it suddenly, spears their brain with a big metal rod and then yanks them out of the hole and throws them into the mulch pile. And then that leads me to this great image here of these sunken holes in the ground, which, could be chicken coops, or alternatively, another possibility was that we were talking about how chickens get broken down. And up to now, it's been a sort of mechanical process involving hot liquids and arms and surgical blades, but, it also could be that they've perfected a technique of throwing the chickens into some kind of vat of bacterial mulch that only eats feather and bone, and then all the sort of chicken meat matter just drops out the bottom and lands in this facility below, where robotic sweepers just sweep the meat into these holes as and when it arrives. So that's another possibility. It could be wonderfully creepy. Oh, here's some more skeleton structures. So you were toying with the concept that the facility itself might actually look like a chicken skeleton in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and that you could go on a journey sort of through that chicken, and you wouldn't necessarily know which part of it you were in. You'd have to pull back a long way to get an actual sense of what it was you were inside. I was looking at some reference photographs of a place I think it's in South America, it's caves, and the caves reminded me of the open spaces that you might find within a skeleton's, the eye socket or the part in the beak. And I thought that this is for this sketch, which looks like a cave, but it's actually, you think you're passing through a normal landscape. It's actually a big old piece of bone or carcass.
Well,
that's
they're weirdly beautiful as well as ominous and foreboding, which I think is a nice combination. And this is fascinating. This is like a spinal column almost, or a cross section.
I think it's interesting because to me, bone structure does have a sort of resonance of landscape, because rocks and canyons and things are made up of layers, and it's all the same stuff at the end of the day. And you've got kitchen middens it's like a bin or a waste pile of bones and shells that people have eaten over hundreds of years, and then combined with soil, and then it breaks down, or the kind of flesh or waste breaks down, but the shell and the bone is left behind. And it's when you cut through it, if anyone was to do an architectural dig, you can see the actual traces of the time that the things have been discarded or eaten, and I think that's really interesting to see layers of history within a structure.
So what is this wonderful sculpture here on?
That is a sculpture by a lady called Cathy de Monchaux, and she uses quite an interesting juxtaposition of materials, a very shiny brass metal that looks like it's been laser cut. It's really precise and planned and quite sort of Gothic shapes, and she combines that with more organic materials, so fur and leather, and the structures she makes are kind of really confused. They're sort of, and it's a horrible hybrid, which makes you just kind of feel like really unsettled. But I thought it was really interesting that you could combine materials in this way and make it look like it has a purpose, that it was designed for something in mind, but you're not quite sure whether it's been manufactured or whether it's an actual entity on its own. And you're never really sure, which is why I liked that particular image.
It looks like jellyfish flour sausage or something. It's wonderfully weird. And and actually, when you said metal and leather and that's very, I could see how kind of decadent and strange those materials are when used together. Here's a great collage of textures and light. And the one in the middle is one of my favorites, because there's this kind of like fleshy looking mouth in the middle. Surrounded by all these pneumatic tubes, cables, and dials and cisterns and things. It's really strange. What is that facility? Do you know?
I think it's inside. I think it's some kind of engine, a really quite an old, early. I think it's inside steam train.
It's beautifully complicated and very analog. which you don't see much these days. There's a sort of a trend towards simplicity, but I think you lose something sometimes. Amazing feats of engineering. Well, this is fantastic. Thank you for sharing this with us.
Oh, you're welcome.